Were Vikings really just brutal warriors, or was there something far stranger lurking beneath their horned helmets? Did women hold power in ways we can barely imagine, or were they simply shadows in a world dominated by men? And what about those who weren't quite human? Let's dive into the messy, complicated, and utterly fascinating world of the Viking Age, where borders blurred, identities shifted, and the line between life and death, and even between human and something else, was terrifyingly thin. Imagine a scene: a vast windswept plain, the air thick with the smell of blood, manure, and fear. Cattle and horses lay scattered, their bodies covered in a thick layer of mud and straw, a gruesome tableau of sudden, violent death. Sheep and lambs huddled together, a panicked mob pressed against the north door of a longhouse, blocking their escape. But the animals weren't alone. Amidst the carnage, bodies, men and children lay sprawled, a horrifying mosaic of loss and chaos. This wasn't a raid gone wrong, not entirely. It was something deeper, something more unsettling. These weren't just victims of battle. They were Jostner, stable living thralls, a special, almost forgotten category of enslaved people who lived and worked alongside the animals they tended. And the way they'd been arranged, the way they'd been swallowed by the earth, it spoke of a chilling disregard for the value of human life. The longhouse itself, a massive, timber-framed structure, hadn't been cleared away. Instead, it had been deliberately buried, covered in a mound of earth and charred timbers, transforming the entire building into a grim, silent tomb. It was a statement, a brutal assertion of equality, or rather, a horrifying lack thereof. No distinction was made between humans and animals; they were simply consumed. The village continued to thrive, a strange, unsettling juxtaposition of daily life and this monumental, ever-present reminder of the past. For decades, the inhabitants carried on with their routines, their lives intertwined with the shadow of this massive burial mound. It was a constant, tangible weight, a silent witness to a tragedy that refused to be forgotten. But what really happened that night? The archaeological evidence is fragmented, indirect, hinting at a story far more complex than a simple raid. The Vikings weren't just interested in acquiring slaves, they were building an entire economy around their exploitation. Think about the tar production industry, a massive undertaking that required an enormous workforce. And then there was the rise of sailcloth, driving the demand for wool and therefore for sheep. Suddenly, the need for labor exploded, creating a self-reinforcing cycle of exploitation. Smaller structures began to appear around the estates, thralls' quarters, perhaps evidence of a growing, increasingly organized system of servitude. And as raiding for slaves escalated, these thralls weren't just laborers, they were building fleets, preparing ships for assault. Their lives were inextricably linked to the Viking expansion, their suffering fueling the very engines of their power. Let's talk about the slaves themselves. What did they look like? What did they own? The archaeological record offers surprisingly little. There were no specific markers of enslavement, no unique jewelry, no distinctive tools. The clothing and possessions of thralls reflected the lowest level of social status, indistinguishable from those of the poorest free people. They were essentially cast-offs, unwanted items, absorbed into the general material culture of the time. But there's a darker, more unsettling story hidden in the burial records. Early Viking burials often featured multiple individuals interred alongside the primary occupant, a disturbing practice that suggests a ritualistic element, a need to accompany the dead on their final journey. We're talking dozens of examples across the Viking diaspora, each one a chilling testament to the violence and desperation of the time. Let's focus on one particularly gruesome example from Ballateare, on the Isle of Man. A young Scandinavian high-status man was interred in a coffin, surrounded by a terrifying arsenal of weapons. But his grave wasn't just filled with arms, it was also covered by an elaborate burial mound constructed from layers of soil taken from his own fields. And then on top of the mound lay the corpse of a woman, her skull brutally removed with a single, precise blow. Around her, the ashes of a horse, an ox, and a sheep, a macabre offering, a symbolic representation of the thralls who had perished alongside her. It's a scene that chills to the bone, a stark reminder of the way the Vikings viewed their enslaved people as possessions, as sacrifices, as extensions of their own power. The accounts of Arab travelers from the East provide further insight into this disturbing practice. They described similar rituals, the mass slaughter of war captives and enslaved people during funeral rites. This wasn't just a Viking phenomenon, it was a widespread custom, a brutal expression of power and control. But could these victims have been criminals, prisoners of war, or simply those deemed expendable by the community? The truth is, we may never know for sure. The archaeological evidence is frustratingly ambiguous, leaving us to grapple with a disturbing ambiguity. Recent scientific analysis has shed new light on the remains of these sacrificed individuals. Oxygen isotope studies of Norwegian Viking Age burials revealed a stark difference in diet between the primary burials and the executed victims. The sacrificed people had a markedly inferior diet, suggesting a lower social status. Similarly, Swedish burials revealed a greater consumption of freshwater fish among the victims, a subtle but significant clue. And then there were the dental modifications, filed grooves in the teeth. Were these a marker of enslavement, a brand on the flesh, a permanent reminder of their status? Or did they have a different meaning in this context? The Vikings were masters of adaptation, of incorporating elements from other cultures into their own practices. It's possible that the filing served a different purpose, a subtle form of identification or perhaps even a symbolic act of resistance. The story of the thralls isn't just about exploitation and violence, it's also about fluidity and ambiguity. Some enslaved people were once free, voluntarily or involuntarily. Their status could change, shifting like sand dunes in the wind. These sacrificed men may have been war captives, or the filing might have meant something entirely different in this context. Consider this: the people killed by the gravesides of others were of lower status, which strengthens the idea that at least some of them were thralls. But the evidence is never straightforward. The boundaries were porous, the identities fluid. Let's talk about gender. Viking society was patriarchal, undeniably so. But beneath the surface of this rigid structure lay a surprising degree of fluidity. Men and women both held positions of power, albeit in different spheres. Men dominated the public realm, the sea, the battlefield, the courts, while women controlled the domestic sphere, managing the household, raising children, and overseeing the economy. But this wasn't a simple division of labor. Women were also active participants in religious rituals, officiating at sacrifices and maintaining connections with the other worlds. They were the keepers of the spiritual economy, the intermediaries between the community and the gods. And then there were the outliers, the individuals who defied expectations, who challenged the norms of gender. There are accounts of women acting as judges, owning property, and conducting trade, all without facing significant social prejudice. The Vikings weren't simply warriors and raiders, they were complex, contradictory individuals, capable of both brutal violence and surprising compassion. They were comfortable with ambiguity, with blurring the lines between the sacred and the profane, the human and the animal. Now let's consider the concept of queer identities. It's a modern term, of course, but the Vikings certainly engaged in practices that would align with our understanding of gender and sexuality today. There's evidence of cross-dressing, of challenging traditional gender roles, of embracing alternative forms of relationships. The Norse sagas are filled with ambiguous characters, individuals who defy easy categorization, whose identities are fluid and constantly shifting. The Vikings were comfortable with the margins, with the spaces between the established norms. They weren't afraid to transgress boundaries, to test limits. This willingness to embrace the unconventional is a key element of their enduring appeal. But what about the children? Their burials offer a fascinating glimpse into the Viking Age. Many young children were buried with full sets of grave goods, tiny jewelry, miniature weapons, suggesting that they were treated with a degree of respect and importance. However, there are also instances of infant remains found in middens and refuse pits, hinting at a darker reality, a preference for infanticide, a rejection of those deemed unwanted. The discovery of infant remains is a chilling reminder of the harsh realities of Viking Age life, a testament to the precariousness of existence. So, what does it all mean? The Viking Age was a time of borders between cultures and ways of life, between different views of reality, and between individuals. It was a time of transgression, of testing boundaries, of erasing and redefining identities. And it's a time that continues to fascinate and challenge us today. But let's return to the question of those buried alongside the dead, the thralls. Were they simply possessions, extensions of the deceased's power, or were they something more? Were they criminals, prisoners of war, or simply victims of a brutal and unforgiving society? The answer, perhaps, is that they were all of these things. They were victims of circumstance, casualties of a system built on exploitation and violence. They were silenced, forgotten, erased from the historical record, but their story deserves to be told. It's a story of suffering and resilience, of loss and remembrance. It's a story that challenges us to confront the uncomfortable truths of the past and to consider the implications for the present. And finally, the question remains, what really happened that night? What drove the Vikings to commit such a horrific act of mass slaughter? Was it a ritualistic sacrifice, a display of power, or simply a desperate attempt to control a chaotic and unpredictable world? The truth, as always, is likely to be more complex and nuanced than any single explanation can convey. But one thing is certain, the Viking Age was a time of profound contradictions, a time when the boundaries between life and death, between human and animal, between power and vulnerability, were constantly being tested and redefined. And as we stand here surrounded by the ghosts of the past, we are left with a haunting question. What legacy did the Vikings leave behind? A legacy of violence and conquest, or a legacy of innovation and exploration? The answer, it seems, is both. But perhaps the most important thing to remember is this: the Vikings were not simply warriors and raiders. They were human beings, flawed and complex, capable of both great cruelty and great compassion. And their story, like all stories, deserves to be told, not just for what it reveals about the past, but for what it can teach us about the present. So let's continue to dig, to investigate, to question. Let's unravel the mysteries of the Viking Age, and in doing so, perhaps gain a deeper understanding of ourselves. But one final, lingering question remains. If we could step back in time and witness that night in the Longhouse, what would we see? Would we be horrified by the carnage? Or would we be struck by a strange, unsettling beauty? Would we recognize ourselves in the faces of the dead men, women, and children, all united in their shared fate? The answer, I suspect, is that we would be left with a profound and unsettling sense of wonder. Because the Viking Age was a time when the boundaries of reality were blurred, and when the very nature of being human was called into question.